Think we're live.
Awesome. Good evening and welcome to Edgemont High School's annual Financing College presentation. We are so glad you're with us tonight. My name is Emily Coleman and I am a member of the high school counseling team. I'm joined by my colleagues tonight, Jamie Brookman and Stephanie Fuentes. And we are also privileged to have two of our administrators with us tonight, Kyle Hosier and Mary Rose Joseph. Tonight, we are thrilled to be joined by the extremely knowledgeable Mike Collins, who is the Director of Financial Aid at Case Western University. Mr. Collins joins the Office of Undergraduate Admissions at Case Western as first as an admissions counselor before transitioning in 2012 to the Office of University Financial Aid, where he had actually previously worked as a student employee. He is a lifelong Clevelander and a Case Western Reserve alum, and he earned his Bachelor's of Arts in Chemistry with a minor in history, which I'm very impressed about. And during his time as a student, Mr. Collins played varsity football, sang in the gospel choir, and was also involved in a variety of other groups and organizations. But most importantly, he is committed to helping demystify financial aid for families by educating them on the tools and processes available. And we are extremely honored to have him with us tonight. Before I hand the floor over to Mr. Collins, I just want to let everyone know if they have questions during the presentation, we encourage you to ask using the Google form that's on the Financing College website that you entered to access this workshop. We will keep the Ask a Question form open until around 7:30 p.m., and this form will be monitored for questions that come up. We do ask that your questions remain general so that they can be beneficial to all participants. And if there's time at the end of the presentation, we will share those questions with Mr. Collins. So, without further ado, I hand the mic over. Mr. Collins, it's all yours.
Thanks, Emily. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right. So thank you again for having me. I hope that by the time we finish today, I can make things a little bit clearer for you, make you a little bit less anxious, and at least give you a better understanding of just how financial aid works and sort of some of the questions you might need to ask schools or the things that you might want to focus on. So, whenever I start talking about financial aid, the first thing that I really want everybody to understand is exactly what financial aid is. And there is, believe it or not, an official, really long-winded answer. I can read it for you. Financial aid consists of funds provided to students and their families to help pay for post-secondary college or university educational expenses as outlined in each school's cost of attendance budget. Now, to be honest with you, that's a lot. It's a lot for me. And without it being up there, I wouldn't remember it like that. I like to try to break things down as simple as possible to make it easier to understand and easier to fit into whatever your situation is. And what I like to say is that in those most simplest terms, think of financial aid as anything that is not coming from you or your parents' bank accounts. So if it's not something that you're paying from one account to the university to the school, it is considered financial aid. And sometimes that's hard for families to understand. They may think about some of the types of aid, such as loans or work, and they see, okay, I have to pay the loans back, or I have to actually do something in order to earn the funds, and they don't look at it in the same way. But as a university, as a school, and probably more importantly, as a federal government, those are things that are considered aid that are typically included in the different calculations. Now, when we talk about financial aid and sort of what type of aid you might be eligible for, what you might need to go to the school, how much help you might need in order to pay the bills, it always starts with the cost of attendance. And that cost of attendance, think of it also as the legal limit of aid you can receive, no matter where that aid comes from. So it doesn't matter if it's a private foundation, it doesn't matter if it's from the school, if it's from some outside organization, it's all considered aid, and there's limits on what you're able to receive. Now, those limits are going to vary from school to school. So a school in New York that has a price at one point, and a school in Ohio with a different price, and a school in Texas, every school across the country is going to have a different cost of attendance. Now, the cost of attendance, again, is think of it more as an estimate of what you'll need. So it's not the same thing as saying this is what you are going to pay when you go to attend that school. And I do have an example from this current school year, 24-25. In general, a public school typically is or has a lower cost of attendance than a private school does. But I'm going to just say this up front, and I'll probably say this repeatedly throughout the presentation. Just because a school costs more doesn't mean that you are going to actually pay more. So I want you to just kind of keep that in mind as you're going through the process. And that's also why it's really important to make sure that if you are concerned about what a school may cost, what you may need, that you're getting in contact with whoever the financial aid officers are at the schools you're interested in as soon as possible. Now, in making up that cost of attendance, there's a couple of different categories. And the first one that's probably the most important, because these are the things that will be on the actual bill, are what we like to call costs payable to the school. And that's exactly as it sounds. It's things that you are going to pay to the college or university in order for you to not only attend, but also for you to be able to continue. And those things you probably have heard some of these before: tuition and fees and housing and meal plans. Again, they're going to be different for every school, but it's important to pay attention to what type of school you're looking at, you're considering, and how they treat those costs. There will be some schools that will charge you per class. There may be other schools that charge you per credit hour. Some schools will have limits. So if you reach typically 12 credits is what's needed for a full-time course load. And for some schools, it doesn't matter whether you take 12 credits or you take 24, the tuition price is going to be the same. So if you're trying to figure out, okay, I know that the tuition is what it is, and what are ways that I can use to help minimize those costs, that might be a really good thing for you to do. Likewise, when it comes to housing and the meals, you may have some different options in terms of what you do and don't need and what you do and don't pay. So maybe there's an option for you to live off campus, or maybe there's an option for you to commute. Well, generally, those options are going to be a little bit cheaper than staying on campus. But that won't always be the place or won't always be the case. So it will really just depend upon what the situation is for that university. Same thing for the meal plans. One of the recent updates to the regulations for schools, it requires that for students who are living on campus, schools must have in that cost of attendance, in those figures that I'm talking about, enough of an allowance for the meal plan for students to eat 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. If you're anything like my daughter, she doesn't really eat breakfast. She probably does not eat 3 meals a day. She may eat two and maybe have a couple of big snacks throughout the day. And so that may be something, if that's like you, and I've actually heard that a lot of high school students may even eat a little bit less than that sometimes. Maybe there's a way for you to get off of the meal plan, or maybe there's a way for you to change what the meal plan is. The one thing I always say when students are telling me that they're considering removing or getting off of the meal plan in order to save costs, I always ask whether or not you know how to cook and whether or not you will have time to cook. Because if you don't know how to cook or you don't have time to cook, I'm not a really big proponent of being off of the meal plan, because you're probably not going to be eating the healthiest. You're probably not going to have the healthiest diet. And to be honest, eating out all the time is going to be more expensive. So if you're doing this to save costs, then you may end up costing a little bit more, or costing yourself a little bit more in the long run. Now, just as there are costs payable to the university, there's also costs that are payable to other people, people outside of the university. And these are also put onto the cost of attendance. again, it's more of a expectation, the cost of attendance of what you're expected for the full year. And while you may not necessarily pay the school for your books and supplies, you do need to pay something. For you to go to school, you need books. You may need to rent the books. You may need to get the books from the library. You may need to or want to buy the books from an older student, which are all really great ways for you to be able to get what you need and to possibly help reduce the price a little bit. They have books that are all electronic now that will cost a little bit less than physical books. Um, I'm a real big proponent of going to the library. Libraries still have books. The books are free. Now, I say this, and I'm not telling you to actually do this, but I will say that when I was doing some of my history classes, there were times where I went to the library and got my books and renewed the books because the library lets you do that. You can borrow them and you can tell them I still need them, and they'll let you keep them. Now, eventually, you'll get to the point where they'll tell you, no, you can't do that anymore. You need to turn the books back in. Now, I say this, and again, I'm not telling you to do this, but I was one of those people, one of those students who said, I'm just going to keep the books. I had my books all semester, and it was finals, and I said, I just need it for a couple more weeks. I'll just go ahead and pay whatever the fine was. Again, not saying you need to do that, but I did end up paying about $2 or $3 that year for about $300 worth of books. So again, it's how resourceful you are can really impact what some of these other costs are. Personal expenses and transportation is another thing. When you go to school, for most students, the experiences and the things that you will have or do outside of the classroom can be just as important as the things that you'll experience inside of the classroom. And typically, they're not free. So you do need to plan for that. And so every school will have these personal expenses and transportation costs factored in there, giving you an idea of about how expensive it is for their students to go out and have some of those experiences outside of the classroom. So those are the factors that make up the bulk of the cost of attendance. There may be a few changes from school to school with fees and licensing and maybe a few other things, but all in all, most schools will have all of these different components to it. So you take that cost of attendance and you subtract what's called the student aid index. And that is the information that you get from the FAFSA and from the CSS profile. Those are the two most popular types of financial aid forms. The FAFSA is the government's application for financial aid, the free application for federal student aid. And I do want to focus on the free part provided by the Department of Education. The CSS profile is the College Board's version of that same form. So this is the same College Board who runs the SAT. If you've taken that, if you've taken any type of AP classes, they have their own financial aid form as well. Practically every school will use the FAFSA because that is something that is required for any type of federal funding. And a lot of state and other outside private funding may use some of that information as well. The CSS profile is typically used by schools for their own institutional funding. So if a school such as Case Western Reserve wants to provide other types of grants or scholarships to students, that gives us a different way to receive some of that same information that the FAFSA has. Now, some of the changes for the FAFSA over the past year or two, it makes it a little bit or completely a different form than what it was before. It's typically easier for people to complete now, but it does require a little bit more upfront work in order for that to be done. There's a lot of organizations out there. There's a lot of people out there who will advertise completing the FAFSA or with that information for helping with that information for a price. And generally, we try to stay away from that because it is free and because of how simple and how easy it is now, especially compared to what it was. at least go out and try, just go out to studentaid.gov. That's where you will complete the form. That's where they will have a bunch of information and articles about exactly what it is that you might need to do. But the biggest thing that you need is to create a federal student aid ID. And that's something that each student will need to do, as well as each parent. If you are married, if you are maybe separated but still living together, even if you're unmarried and living together, chances are both parents will need to complete their own FSA ID in order for their information to be uploaded into the FAFSA. Part of what makes it so easy now is you create that ID, you're verifying your identity, you're putting in your information, and when you go out to the FAFSA, what it's going to do is actually use your information to log into the IRS and pull your tax information. So you don't need your taxes anymore. You don't have to go remembering the forms. You don't have to figure out the different line items or any of those things. It will pull it directly from the IRS. And if you're filing jointly, that makes it even easier because you only need one parent to do it. But if you don't have your taxes together, that's where each parent may need to do this themselves. So I always recommend the FAFSA. It becomes available on October 1st. That's actually, well, it's been available on October 1st for years, up until recently when they were making a few changes there. And there's been a law change this year to mandate that it's available on October 1st in the future as well. I like to tell families, okay, if it comes out on October 1st, maybe give it a week, let them work out all the bugs, work out all the kinks, and then go ahead and submit it. Another great thing about the FAFSA is the fact that you can actually submit it as many times as you need to. Granted, you don't want to do it a ton of times if you don't have to, but if you realize that you did make a mistake, you're able to go out there and fix it. And because it's free, there's no cost associated with it. You just have to go out and get that done. So I talked about the student aid index. I talked about the cost of attendance, and you may hear schools talking about meeting financial need. I know that's one of the buzzwords or one of the buzz terms that are out there now. And this is what schools are talking about. They're taking that cost of attendance, they're subtracting the information that they get from the FAFSA and the CSS profile, and that difference is what's called the financial need. And that need does impact the amount of aid and the type of aid that you might be able to receive. Now, it will be handled differently by every type of school, and the different types of aid will have an impact on it as well. Things such as some of the different federal grants, for example, are only going to be available to students who have a lower student aid index, who have more of that need available because they have less resources. And for other types of aid, maybe a scholarship, that won't play a factor at all. So there are different types of aid that need will factor into, but how much you receive, this FAFSA and the CSS profile, those financial aid forms are going to be that starting point. So I talked about scholarships and grants a little bit, and that is the aid that everybody wants. That is the aid that you should be doing everything you can to get as much of as possible because it is essentially free money. It's money that does not have to be paid back. Some merit scholarships don't require an application. Some are automatically included. So with just by you applying for admission, you're applying for those merit-based scholarships already. There will be others where you may need to do a essay or submit an application or turn in a portfolio or do a project. There isn't just one set way for you to receive those scholarships. So you want to cast as wide a net as possible to give yourself the best chance you can to receive as much of that free money as you can. Grants are typically based on the information from the FAFSA or the CSS profile, and that's how they differ. It's still a different type of free money, but whereas those merit scholarships are based on what the student has done, hence the application and the other requirements, the grants are based on what parents have earned or saved, thinking of what resources they might have and savings and 529s and whatever else they may have available, that's where the grants come in. But again, free money is free money, and if you can get it and you're eligible for it, I say go ahead and try. Now, there's a lot of different sources when it comes to scholarships and grants. The federal government is probably the biggest provider of aid in the country, but that's because they're providing aid to the largest number of students as well. And so when you break down the grants and scholarships that might be available from the government, it actually turns out to be not so big of an amount on a student by student basis. Meanwhile, when you consider colleges and universities, while they're not helping as many students as the federal government, they actually tend to give out more money on an individual basis than the federal government does. But there's also money through the state government, through private sources. And if you have not checked yet with your employer or your parents' employers, that's something that you'll want to do as well. A lot of businesses will have some sort of tuition benefit or some other type of arrangement that their employees may be able to use to not only help their children, but it's a really good recruitment tactic as well for parents to know that there's some other benefit outside of just income that they'll be able to use to help their families. Now, loans, on the other hand, are not a bad thing. So I do want to say that just because you may need loans in order to finance a college education, it doesn't mean that you have done anything wrong, that you have not adequately planned. It is the case that college is just more expensive now than it has been in the past. And so for many families, needing loans is just what has to be done, or using loans is just what has to be done in order for them to go out and to attend school. So the key is to focus on the loans as an investment. And like any investment, there will be some good ones and there will be some bad ones that will be available. So you want to try to limit the amount of loans that you borrow while also taking out loans that are as advantageous as possible. The subsidized loan, for example, that's a loan. It is need-based, so it is partially based on the information that schools receive from the FAFSA, but the government will cover the interest while you're in school. And it doesn't matter whether you are in school just for your bachelor's degree or whether you continue on to get a master's or a PhD. Maybe you decide you want to be in school for the next 50 years and earn all the degrees you can. Well, the government will pay the interest while you're in school because that's how the subsidized loan works. The unsubsidized loan, on the other hand, is not interest free. So that interest does start accruing from day one. But for all student loans, you're not required to make any payments while you're in school. And as an added bonus, the government treats the unsubsidized loans differently than your normal mortgage or your normal car note or personal loan that you may take out. For those things, they're typically charging interest on interest. And that's where you sort of see those accounts and see those balances tend to grow. But while you're in school, the unsubsidized loan, it doesn't charge that interest on the interest. It's not capitalized in that manner. Think of it almost as having that interest put into a separate account. So if you take out a $2,000 unsubsidized loan, that interest today will be based on that $2,000, just as that interest tomorrow or next month or next year would still be based on that same $2,000. So it helps the loan to not, or the amount you owe, to not grow as fast using those loans. Parent loans are unsubsidized. The government does not provide the same subsidies for parents, but they do consider the standards for those loans differently because it's through the government. I like to say that for a private organization or a private bank, they're more concerned with whether or not you're going to pay them back. And so they will look at things such as debt to income ratio and credit score and whether or not you're working. The government, on the other hand, being bigger, having some different priorities, they are more concerned about what you've done in the past. Have you paid your bills? So they are just concerned with things such as bankruptcies or foreclosures or repossessions. And if you don't have those things that they're looking for, they call it adverse credit, you'll be approved. They don't even look for better or for worse at whether or not you're working in order to determine if you will qualify for those parent loans. Now, it's not going to be ideal for every family, but knowing that there are those options available and that those standards are different, that can impact how you approach this process as well. Now, for students, many students do work while they're in school, and I do believe that working can be a really great tool to allow students to succeed. I know that I find students who work, they're typically a little bit more successful because the very act of them having a job helps them to better manage their time and it helps them to stay more connected to the university. It allows more eyes to be on them. So if something abnormal were to happen, maybe they stop showing up to work to a job that they really love. There's somebody who can reach out to them, who can make sure that they're okay if they're working because they need the money to go to a game or to go to a play or a movie or go out to eat, whatever it may be, they're going to think ahead and say, okay, I want to keep this job so that way, so that means that I need to be a little bit proactive. And maybe I reach out to my supervisor early to let them know, hey, I need a little bit of time off in order for me to finish this paper or finish this project. Well, that means I need to think ahead. I have a paper or a project that's due. And because I have a paper or a project that's due, I need to think about what do I need to do in order to complete that. I need to study. I need to write. I need to do these different things. It has that trickle down effect that at the very beginning, students may not even realize that it's happening, but it does impact sort of what their thinking is. And again, that time management piece, especially in college, if you're off on your own for the first time, can be really beneficial to have that set up in place. And then just being able to network. Emily mentioned that my job when I was a student was in the financial aid office. And that's sort of what led me back here. When I graduated from Case Western Reserve, I had no idea, no thoughts about ever coming back to the school and working in the financial aid office or the admission office or anything like that. My first job, I was working in a pharmaceutical company, which was really fun and I really loved it. But eventually I decided that I needed a change, and that's what helped lead me back here. I wouldn't have thought about that before. And some of the connections that I made when I was a student is what helped me lead back here. But those same connections can help you go on if you decided, again, to be an engineer or to be a doctor or whatever it is that you want to do. Meeting those people, understanding how to network, when to network, what to say, how to handle yourself, and to do that in a setting such as student employment where typically you're around other students and people who are used to other students, it gives you that grace, it gives you that opportunity, it gives you that space to be able to learn while not being in the real world and sort of having that safety net to help you succeed. Now, I talked about outside scholarships a little bit when I was talking about the different sources of aid that might be available. And I really want to make sure that you all understand that outside scholarships are going to be one of the best options you have to help reduce whatever costs you may have in going to school. By the time you graduate, it's going to be too late for you to make changes to your class schedule, for you to go back in time and to save more money or to have more investments or maybe to change what your investments are. You won't be able to do those things. But outside scholarships is something that you will have direct control over. I should Let me specify, you will have direct control over how much you do and how much you put out there to see just what's available. I always recommend that students and families start with things in their own community first. Local scholarships, local organizations, talking to your high school counselors, that will be your best resource to figure out what things near you are going, could possibly help with your search. They may hear your counselors, for example, may hear about other scholarships that students may have received in the past. There may be businesses around that are to willing to help out. Same thing with religious organizations that are near you. One of our student workers got his very first scholarship, his second semester of his senior year, from a church that had a mandate to help people from the community. So while it wasn't a church that he belonged to, because he lived in the area, he was able to apply for that scholarship. And you know what? The church said that they didn't have enough people applying. They actually ended up giving him double because he was getting ready to graduate and they had those extra funds available and they said this is just something that we want to do. So always, always, always start with those things that are near you. Start with your counselor, start with local community organizations or businesses or religious organizations to see what might be there. After that, I always recommend using search engines. There's a lot of different engines that are out there. If you just do a simple web search and you search for a scholarship search engine, you'll be amazed by what's there. Some of them will have 4.5 million, 5 million, 7 million different scholarships available. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the sweepstakes type scholarships where you just enter in your information. There are some legit ones out there, but I like the ones that make you do a little bit of work. Maybe you need to go do an essay or a project or something of that nature. But no matter what type of scholarship you're looking for, if you are not sure whether or not that scholarship or that organization is real, make sure you check up on it. If you see a scholarship on a search engine and it's from the Mike Collins Foundation, well, how about you do a web search and just see, okay, is that the right website for the Mike Collins Foundation? They should hopefully have a link to the scholarship on their foundation site. So that way you can know, okay, this is the right place, this is the right thing that I want to do. And if you have some concerns about it, then you can just go straight to the source and apply right there on the foundation search engine. And that actually leads me to the next thing when I talk about doing your own searches. I love to have families come back to me and tell me that they found scholarships that they didn't find on a search engine or by talking to anybody, but just doing their own homework, their own legwork. And I always say, when you do your own searches, you have to think about what makes you you. What are your interests, your passions, your hobbies, your likes, your dislikes? Those are the things that you want to do a search for. I had a dad a few years ago who told me that the only thing his son liked to do was play the zombie levels of Call of Duty. And so we typed in zombies and we typed in scholarships. And do you know there was a scholarship for people who had plans to survive the zombie apocalypse? I found other scholarships. I said, okay, well, I wonder what other weird or what other fancy scholarships are out there. I'm a, I, I'm a pretty tall guy. I typically don't see too many people around who are taller than I am. And so I said, I wonder if there's a scholarship for that. Well, there is. For men who are 6'2" and taller, or females who are 5'10" and taller, there's a scholarship through the Tall Club International Foundation. I said, okay, well, if there's scholarship for tall people, I wonder if there's one for short people. And there is something through the Little People of America. Average height people, I have not found a scholarship for them yet. But that's what I mean when I say, what is it that makes you you? What are your hobbies, your likes, your passions, your dislikes? What are the things if someone were to describe you that if someone were to describe you, what would they say? And do searches based around those things. For those of you who tell me that there's nothing out there that really relates to you, that you don't have any interests or hobbies or passions or anything like that, well, as just another example, there is another scholarship that I found is nicknamed the Lazy Scholarship. Didn't know lazy people look for scholarships, but they do, apparently. It's for students who don't smoke, who don't do drugs, who don't drink, which you shouldn't be doing those things anyway, but they also do no strenuous activity. So if you're someone who just likes to sit around and watch TV all day, there's a scholarship for that. So I don't want you to limit yourself and limit what you may be able to receive just because you think that there's not something out there. I'm going to be honest with you, looking for some of those outside scholarships is going to be a little bit of work. Many organizations will not send you anything. They won't tell you no, they won't tell you yes, they won't say anything at all. But it just takes one, it just takes a couple to say yes for you to really start realizing those benefits and to get on the road. Every school that receives federal funding is required to have something on their website called the net price calculator. And that is a way for the schools to provide an estimate of not just their costs, but what type of aid might be available. Now, I want to stress that it is an estimate. It's not meant to be exact. It's not meant to be real. It's only meant to give you an idea of what might be possible. So I don't want you to necessarily hold a school to what might be on that calculator. There's a few other reasons for that, especially the ones that are government mandated that makes it a little bit harder. But I find the net price calculator to be most useful for those families who know that they're going to have changes coming up. If you know that you have one child in school already and you're going to have two next year, and the year after that, you're going to have three children in school, you can use that net price calculator. You can put your information in and see, okay, this school says that I'm going to receive about $15,000 in aid while I have that one child in school. Um, I don't know necessarily that that 15,000 is going to be right, but that's what the calculator says. If I put in two and that 15 drops down to or doubles and it goes from 15 to 30, you have an idea, okay, so if I'm receiving whatever aid it is, I should probably expect for that aid to double if I have two children in school. And if you put in there that you have three in school, you may see that aid go from 30 to 45. Okay, so that gives me an idea that no matter what that aid might be that first year, if I have three children in school, I might be eligible for up to about three times as much. That can help with your planning as you're thinking about what am I doing for this first year? What am I doing for that second child? And what am I doing for that third one? Now, I am the oldest, and I like to believe that the oldest children are the favorite. That's just me. But in reality, we expect for families to help support their children equally. And so while the FAFSA no longer looks at the number of children in the house or number of children in college, schools may do that themselves. They may do that through using the CSS profile. They may do that through their own financial aid form. They may do that. Oops, I think I'm in the head here. They may do that through the use of those special and unusual circumstances. That is an option that the government provides to schools to allow schools to be able to say the information on these forms are not necessarily representative of what the family situation is. And so a school can say, based on this information and based on what you just told me, or the information that you just provided to me, or the email that you sent me, we may be able to make some changes to your information to allow you to receive more aid. Now, those special and unusual circumstances, it is entirely up to the school. So just because one school does it, it does not mean that another school will. And even two schools who may look at and approve the same information, they may not necessarily use that information in the same way. So again, something to think about, especially if finances are important, or again, if you know that there are changes that are happening, what are the school's policies? How does the school handle some of those different types of circumstances? If you talk to us, we're more than happy to let you know what we think, what may be possible. But if you're not contacting the financial aid office, there's no way for us to be able to really give you that information. Now, when it comes to the FAFSA, when it comes to most forms of financial aid, you do have to reapply every year. For a lot of schools, the process will be the same each year, so it gives you a chance to get used to it. There may be some schools where the process can change from year to year. Maybe you are required to fill out this information that first year, and after that, maybe you're only required to submit the FAFSA and not the CSS profile, or you're only required to submit the FAFSA and maybe the school's financial aid form, but nothing else. The FAFSA, if you're receiving federal money, whether that is grants or loans or work, it will be required every year because that's just what the law says. But the law also says that it will be available by October 1. So you will be able to submit your information and submit it early. A lot of schools may not necessarily review that information until a lot later. Typically, as a first year or as a student who's looking to go to college, they may focus on their information first because they have to make a decision on where they go to school. And then schools may look at other continuing or returning students. But again, every school will have their own specific policy and their own specific formulas that they'll use. Now, the last two things that I'll talk about, I just want to make sure that you understand that you should not be the one to say that you can't afford a school up front. Make sure that you let the school do that. Ask questions, reach out to the financial aid office, submit the forms that you need to submit, because for a lot of schools, that information in terms of how much aid you might be able to receive, they may not know until they get those forms submitted, until you get everything turned in. If that school has scholarships, sometimes there may be a rubric that they can follow. You have this GPA and you have this test score, therefore you get this amount of financial aid or this amount of scholarship. And for a lot of other schools, there's nothing like that. It's more of a holistic process. You have this grade, you have this test score, but what type of extracurriculars do you have? Or what major are you going into? Or what other type of awards you might have. All of those things can play a factor in what type of aid you might be able to receive. And so I said it before, I'll say it again. Just because a school costs a lot of money doesn't mean that you will actually pay a lot of money. And so I did go through this past summer. I actually used a student who applied to Case Western Reserve, and I put their information into a couple of net price calculators to see how that information would turn out. And you can see here, starting with the cost of attendance, looking and is different for a public in-state versus an out-of-state versus a private school. And for this student that I use, the student aid index had 0 across the board. But for the private school, they did require that CSS profile. And based on that, it said that the family should have a little bit of resources to help. The Pell Grant for all three schools are the same because that's based on the FAFSA. That's not based on where or what school you go to. Some of the other types of federal or state grants that can change from school to school. And so in this case, obviously the in-state school, the student received a little bit more in federal and state grants than the out-of-state student did. But for the private school, they actually receive even more altogether. When you consider how much money the student received from the university itself, again, that's something that varied. And so in this example, for this student, going to that public in-state school was only about $1,100 less, or yeah, $1,100 less than going to that private school, even though that private school cost almost 3 times as much. And so that allows you to have some different types of conversations. If finances is the thing for you, and if you're trying to decide between this in-state school and this private school, well, if the costs are that close together, or even if they're a little bit farther apart, does that private school offer more? Does that private school offer, or the differences that private school offers, is it worth that extra $1,100? Or if it is it worth that extra 5,000 or 10,000 or whatever it might be? If you had your heart set on that out-of-state school and that out-of-state school had a program that was set up specifically for what you wanted to do, in this case, you're looking at about a good, what's that? $32,000 difference. You'll need to make that decision. Is going to that out-of-state school worth that extra $32,000. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But those are conversations that you can start to have that can really make things a lot, I don't want to say easier, but a lot more beneficial, a lot more productive in trying to determine not just where you'll go to school, but also how those costs may factor in and what you might need to do to get there. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I am going to stop sharing here. Um, so Emily, do we have any questions?
I think we had a couple that didn't get answered. Most of them actually did get answered already.
All
Um,
right.
but I don't know if Miss Brookman, do you want to ask, you don't, or sorry, Miss Fuentes, want to ask the questions
Yep,
that were not answered in the presentation already?
sure thing. I think that's only about one or two. Okay. So the first question, and I think this definitely comes up every year, so I'm glad someone asked it. If not, I would have. Is if parents are divorced, is the financial aid package based on the custodial parent's salary or both biological parents? Also, if one parent is remarried, is the step parent salary also taken into consideration?
So I'm glad you answered that question or asked that question, Stephanie, because that is something that's very common. And that is probably one of the things that has become a little bit more complicated as of late. So let's start with the fact that schools will view it differently. And there are some schools that will consider both parents no matter what, both biological parents no matter what. There will be some schools that may just require two parents. And so if the custodial parent has remarried, they may look at just the custodial parent and whoever that new step parent is. Now, for the FAFSA, one of the changes that they made is they now call it a contributor. And typically, that contributor is the person who has made the most amount of money or who is providing the most financial support. And so, in cases where there may be some type of shared custody, that's something that will definitely factor in. The person who makes the most should technically be the person filling out the FAFSA as the contributor. Now, if there's no shared custody, maybe there's a one person has 100%, or there's some sort of divorce decree in that manner, the FAFSA will automatically look at anyone or look at whoever the custodial parent is. And if they're remarried, it will automatically consider that step parent's income and information as well. And there's really no way to get around that.
So I've heard in the past, and I don't know if it's different. I've definitely heard families asking, does it matter who claims whom as a dependent on their taxes? And also when they talk about who's the custodial parent, if they have 50-50 custody, you know, yeah.
So, and that's one of the things that gets confusing. While we may ask for tax information in financial aid, and there may be other tax things that will factor in, the regulations for financial aid are different than taxes. So it doesn't really matter who claims who on the taxes, especially in the case of the 50/50 custody, because the part of the new regulations for the FAFSA is based on that financial support. So if both parents are making the same amount of money, then you might need to look at other things. So both parents making the same amount of money, who is the I guess you probably could have a legit 50/50 split, but typically one student is still going to be with one parent more than the other, whether that they're with that parent during the school year or whether they're with that parent doing other things. Schools will look at, okay, who's paying the health insurance, who's paying for some of the other medical bills or school tuition, whatever those different factors might be. It may get sort of that complicated at times.
Yeah, I've heard also that when they look at the maybe a step parent, they may not be looking at the step parent to contribute directly to the school's education, but to contribute to the family to allow the parent to contribute more. I don't know. all very, it sounds like you're exactly right. It's all very complicated. Um,
It is.
Thank you. The following question, the other question that we had is if a family has non-retirement assets that would likely eliminate them from aid or eligibility, is it still recommended to fill out the FAFSA and or CSS profile?
So at least for the first year, I recommend that everybody fills out the forms no matter what. Because at the end of the day, you don't know what might be available. And even for those families who may have a significant amount of non-retirement assets, a school that's really expensive, they have those higher costs. You may not receive a ton of money, but if you can receive a couple $1,000s and it's worth getting a free couple $1,000s, that might be worth it. At the very least, if you do it that first year, you'll know for a fact, yes, I'm qualified and I'm getting all I can, or no, I'm not qualified and I'm not leaving anything on the table. Um, but also keep in mind that for the FAFSA, it is asking for tax information from 2 years ago and it's asking for your asset information as of today when you fill it out. So you will have those changes. And just because you don't qualify for this first year, it doesn't necessarily mean that you won't qualify for next year or the future. And even going back again to having those multiple children in college, while the FAFSA doesn't look at that, the schools might. And without having that information, there's no chance that they'll be able to help you.
That's excellent. Thank you. And I think that's it for the questions.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much, Mike, for sharing all of your knowledge with us tonight. And thank you for everybody for joining us. And we look forward to working with you and your families through the post-secondary process for the rest of the year.